Hello, welcome. I'm Kelly Fitzsimmons Burton, and I'm joined by my friends from Faulkner University. And today we're going to continue our discussion on Rod Dreher's book, Live Not by Lies. Last time we discussed the chapters on Kolakovich the Prophet and our pre-totalitarian culture. Today we want to discuss chapters 3 and 4, Progressivism as a Religion, and Capitalism, Woke and Watchful. But before we begin, let's introduce ourselves.
My name is Jeff Kreh. I am president and co-founder of Likewise College, which serves the incarcerated in Arkansas with a associate's level Great Books education.
My name is Zak Schmoll. I'm the managing editor of An Unexpected Journal, a quarterly publication of cultural and imaginative apologetics.
Hi, I'm Melissa Cain Travis, and I'm an assistant professor of apologetics at Houston Baptist University.
Great. So we had a really good discussion last time, and maybe some time has lapsed between our conversations, but we're going to pick up where we left off, and that is this chapter on progressivism as a religion. Now, I think about religion a lot as a religious studies teacher, student, scholar. And so I've been thinking about this topic for a while, not just with this book, but it came up originally with cultural Marxism, that term, or critical theory. People often ask me, are these religions? And so I wanted to ask you all what you think. Is progressivism a religion? And we should probably define religion, define progressivism, and see how Dreher defines those things. I have ideas about it, but I'm going to open it up to you first to see if you have anything you want to say.
From the Latin, if I'm not mistaken, religion has to do with the idea of things that are legislated or things that have some legality to them. Now, whether that's a governmental legislation or a divine legislation is really, I don't think, consequential. And it could extend simply to be those things that we do because we think they are necessary, and that we don't just do once, but that they inform our habits. And so, you know, we all do things religiously. We all got up this morning religiously. Although I got up a little later than I normally do religiously, I'm happy to say. And so there are these things that are part of us, and I think that extends it beyond what we might think of as even an institutional or a established religion per se, to the broader context of those things that we think are necessary. And so that would invite a much broader audience into being religious than just people who belong to some non-atheistic organized religious definition.
Yeah. Others? Do you have ideas about how to define religion?
The thing that I always go to when I'm entertaining this question is, does it say something about ultimate reality? Do the adherents of whatever the ideology is share a common belief about what it is that transcends humanity? And that doesn't necessarily have to be a God figure, but what is it that transcends us, that determines how we understand ourselves? What is it that, I don't know the word I'm looking for, but I'm trying to connect this idea of something that transcends us, something larger than we are, that sort of dictates the overarching narrative that we live by. Does that make sense? Yeah. And I definitely see the connection that Dreher makes between progressivism and the idea of religion. And I think he's right when he calls it a rival religion.
Well, I inherited a definition, and I've tested this definition out for about 20 years, including in my PhD program when I was in religious studies. And the definition that I use is that religion is a belief or set of beliefs that we use to give meaning to our experience. And I think Jeff was talking about things like values that we have and habits that we form. It seems like those would be connected to a set of beliefs. And so I kind of outlined some of the categories that we use in comparative religious studies. So something that they have in common, they answer these certain questions. And Melissa, you hit on it. One of them was, how do we explain ultimate reality? So I just want to run a few of these categories by you to see if progressivism fulfills the definition or fits the definition of religion. And one of them is a source of authority. It seems like all religions have a source of authority. It could be the word of God. It could be the Vedas. It doesn't have to be written. It could be a person. And so it seems like we have to think of the source of authority for progressivism if it's a religion. Ultimate reality is a category. Origins, how do we tell our story of origins? What is human nature like? What is the good life? What is the human problem and the solution to the human problem? What is human destiny? And maybe societal destiny, like eschatology is another word we use. The end of the world, how does it end? Social structures and institutional forms, and then the narrative or the story we tell ourselves about ourselves. And so those are some of the categories I use when I compare different religions. And not all religions have those, but they tend to. So it seems like we could use those categories to look at progressivism, whatever that is, to see if it fits and is it a religion. There's probably other things we can add too, like ethics, morality.
It's very interesting because the last one you talked about was kind of the narrative that we tell ourselves about ourselves. And Dreher spent a lot of time talking right near the beginning of the chapter about the myth of progress, right?
Yes.
It's this belief that the future necessarily is going to be better than the past. There's going to be this inevitable kind of march towards, well, I guess we better get back to that term eschatology and what's our ultimate destination for the progressivist. But maybe that's a helpful framework for us to try to, is progressivism a religion? It certainly has that narrative structure built in. Dreher obviously calls it a myth, and I think most of us would agree with that. But progressivists certainly would not. They'd say they're on this march towards, I don't know, what, justice, love, peace, harmony. I don't know. What is that ultimate destination, I suppose?
Yeah.
It might be helpful for progressivists if we bring in what was it Lewis who said Christianity is the greatest myth. It's just that it happens to be true, something along those lines. And so when we talk about myth, that's not necessarily saying fairy tale or something that is not true, but rather it's a way to state things using personalities that with which we can identify that we accept as true or we accept as worthy of pursuit. So, for example, the myth of Hercules at the crossroads, where he's got this choice to make, and it's this great story, and it has probably very little to do with something that ever came into physical existence as a quote unquote true story. But the truth of the story is that we are constantly at a crossroads between whether we will pursue an easy path that leads to something that is vicious or a sublime path that leads to a more virtuous life. And then that story helps us even have a conversation about, well, what does it mean to be vicious? What does it mean to be virtuous? And part of what progressivism is doing, part of what Marxism has sought to do, and this is something I don't know if we said it in the last conversation or if it was if it came up in our conversation preliminary to all of this, but this statement several years ago of a leading political figure that we have to rewrite our history, and the doing away with, the cutting off from these traditional myths, these traditional stories, these narratives, it makes it very, very difficult, and I might even say impossible, to have an objective or anything approaching an objective conversation. And maybe that's part of the goal of progressivism, is to get away from things that are objective and to have select subjective competing theories. I don't know.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that, because the first category that Kelly mentioned for understanding religion is authority, right? So if I cut out anything that went before me, then I am ultimately the authority, right? It's like, if it's only what matters here and now, and if I happen to be kind of on top of the hill right now, then my way goes. So, I mean, there is certainly, if I want myself to be the authority, it's very convenient to just say, oh, the past doesn't matter. It's all useless. It's all out of date, whatever word you want to use. So we just have to get rid of it. It's hateful and useless.
Yeah.
So who's the authority? Who gets to decide the authority?
Yeah, it does seem like Dreher brings in James Lindsay, and they both talk about the doctrines of progressivism, and doctrines are beliefs, and beliefs are either true or false, but we can't use those categories anymore because that's part of the problem. That's oppressive. And so we kind of get rid of a rational discussion for determining which narrative we should go with. And in its place, it's feelings or will to power. So we've not only gotten away from an older traditional, maybe Judeo-Christian narrative, we've also gone away from using the word or reason as the way we evaluate narratives or worldviews or religions or whatever you want to call them. So it's it's a mess. It's like we've cut off the means for conversing across the narratives.
But at the same time, if you know that your ideology can't hold up to that kind of scrutiny, you have a very powerful interest to want to cut out that verification process. I mean, if you never have to fight the battle, you don't have to worry about losing the battle. So if you can undermine and just not let the battle take place, I mean, now you just have to, I don't know, have a better marketing team to sell your ideology, I guess.
So I'm reading this passage on page 51 of Dreher's book. I keep coming back to it. I've probably looked at it a dozen times today. But he makes the statement that progressivism in all its forms appeals to the same desire in intelligent young people today, both secular and those within churches who are alienated from authoritative ecclesial traditions. And what caught my attention so strongly was this word desire. And so I'm wondering if this relates to the question of whether or not we can classify progressivism as a religion, because it seems that what Dreher's getting at is there's something about it as an ideology that resonates with these, especially the young intellectuals of today, because they're experiencing what is a universal human desire for something greater and a cause and something to give meaning and purpose and hope to the human experience. And as we observe, especially over the past year, it's done so with what we could legitimately call a religious fervor, right? And so I think just by observing that alone, we could classify it justifiably as a religion. And when Jeff, you mentioned C.S. Lewis earlier, it immediately clicked in my head along this same line that maybe where C.S. Lewis could point us here is his argument from desire. Like they're experiencing this universal human longing. It's this sense of desire that we have for the things that I mentioned a moment ago. It's just their beliefs about how to satisfy the desire are bent, to use the word Lewis probably would have used in this context.
Well, and it's also very it's very evangelical. Progressivism is. It's not content. I don't meet very many progressives who say, I am going to practice non-institutional Marxism. You know, and I'm going to make the choice of what I'm going to do with this, that, and the other, and you are free to do whatever you want to do. It only works through evangelizing others to the cause, and those who won't submit ultimately, at least according to history, a harsh reading of history, those who won't submit just get to go away. Either you go to a work camp and you're re-educated, or you're just broken down, or you're just taken out in a field and told to dig a hole and then shot in the head. And so the evangelical aspect of it, or the need to convert others in order for it to work, at least has some hintings of traditional religion. It's a little different. I don't need somebody to convert to Christianity for me to be able to practice Christianity. But it seems like a progressive or a Marxist or a socialist needs that critical mass of others in order to carry out their desire.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of Augustine's City of God, where you have this human kind of battle between, the city of man and the city of God. And it does seem like humans need to be part of a battle, part of a cause. They need to feel like their lives matter more than just themselves. And I think, Jeff, what you're getting at is this: you need to convert people to achieve social justice, because it requires all of us. So it is kind of a big cause, and I can see why it's attractive to young people. Young people want to be part of a cause. I still want to be part of a cause.
But how big is it if it only succeeds because of its bigness?
It's
in the range of ideas.
It's total. This is like a total war.
Right. But without achieving totality, it's impotent.
Yeah. But there's hope, right?
That sets up the comparison of ideas. We see this 2,000-year-old idea that comes out of obscure poverty in one of the still most languishing regions of the earth, and has somehow elevated society and thought, at least demonstrated in the Western canon. And that did not require totality to be potent, but something that requires absolute involvement in order to be potent is in and of itself impotent, I think.
I think that's why they have to resort to things we're going to talk about in the next chapter. You need to force it. You have to use power to bring it about, because you've already cut out the power of reason and the power of ideas to convert people. So I think you're right. It's ultimately not going to last.
So can that, I guess, getting to another point on the list here, how does movement through or causation by strictly power and not a voluntary involvement, a non-coercive involvement, how does that historically lead to the good life? Is there a philosophical system wherein might makes right leads people to the good life? I see Melissa shaking her head.
I'll say not for the vast majority of people who are trampled on by the system. A few people might have a pretty great life at the top. They get whatever they want, and they run over the rest of the world to do it. But yeah, I can't think of a system where the good life for the general populace is achieved by might makes right.
So help me here, because I feel like we're hitting on sort of a contradictory notion within progressivism itself, because if the idea is the individual self is the ultimate authority over your life, then who gets to decide in terms of the might makes right? I mean, like, if everyone's not on board with your cause, then what right do you have to force your, well, maybe they wouldn't use the word religious beliefs, but let's just call it what it is. What gives you the right to force your religious beliefs on a fraction of society that doesn't see eye to eye with you? What if their truth doesn't line up with your truth? And so it's kind of like this contradictory notion of what you're going to claim is the ultimate authority, right?
It is really interesting, because Dreher talks a little bit about this, because they may claim, right, your truth, my truth, there's no ultimate truth. Yet progressivism is driven by a very definite kind of outline of beliefs, right? And if you don't line up, you get canceled, you get deplatformed, you get kicked out, whatever, choose your verb. So it is interesting. I mean, they talk about subjectivism an awful lot, yet it does seem like there is a certain objective set of beliefs that they hold, even though they deny that they hold objective beliefs, which of course then runs us into a contradiction, like you said. But I just find that so fascinating. Or you can't have a belief in truth, because that is, we've moved beyond that, right? We understand that everyone defines their own truth. But if you don't accept the narrative, aka the truth, I don't know where that leaves you. Like, it's a really fascinating system.
Yeah, I feel this contradiction too. And it seems like there is definitely a view of truth with this system. I'm going to call it a belief. But it seems like there's a struggle for defining what is true. And truth is defined by those who are in power. And so it's not just the individual. I mean, we could say, oh, yeah, it's comfort for whoever, but it seems like they want to liberate the self from whatever oppresses. It could be religion, traditional religion. It could be, I don't know, the patriarchy, whatever. But it's liberation for the groups who were oppressed by those previous views. And so this view is true now because, well, those in power said so. And you need to conform yourself to this view of truth, because then you will be liberated. That's what I'm thinking.
And so if you refuse to be liberated, then are you perpetuating the oppressive system? Or if you
Yes.
refuse to acknowledge your need for liberation, then you are perpetuating the problem?
Right. So you have
Interesting.
false consciousness and you might need to be re-educated. And that's why we have those, trainings.
It's so interesting. Right at the beginning of chapter 3, where they're talking about that banquet in Moscow, and just kind of the excitement of this revolution that's about to take place. And I'll just read maybe a sentence or two here. We are witnesses of the greatest moment of summing up in history, in the name of a new and unknown culture, which will be created by us and which will also sweep us away. That is why, without fear or misgiving, I raise my glass to the ruined walls of the beautiful palaces, as well as to the new commandments of a new aesthetic. The only wish that I, an incorrigible centralist, can express is that the forthcoming struggle should not damage the amenities of life, and that the death should be as beautiful and as illuminating as the resurrection. So, I mean, and this is like a celebratory banquet dinner. Like, this is supposed to be awesome. And so it's just so fascinating that, you know, I don't know, the triumphant tone, we're leading somewhere and it's going to be good, and we don't even really know where we're headed, but it's got to be better than the past. It just strikes me as so odd. The whole thing is it's such an interesting kind of undefined yet incredibly optimistic view of human nature.
Human nature as we would make it in our image.
Yeah, as humans, as the gods of the world.
Mm-mm.
And
So
we
is that?
sorry,
sorry,
go ahead,
Melissa.
Jeff.
Well, I was just going to maybe press on to human destiny, and is that the progressive aim, that we become we become what we were intended to be originally, just not according to the original path? So I think we are intended. We are, and this is going to get me in trouble with some folks, I'm sure, but as one who assumes Christianity and believes the doctrines, especially of the creation narrative as it applies to being made in God's image, we are made ultimately, by the end of the story, the literature wraps up with, we are co-heirs with Christ as God himself. And so our path is to become, our human destiny is to become equal in the eternal picture. Is there a form of that progressivism is aiming towards, but for a here and now?
Which then ties us back to Melissa's point about C.S. Lewis and the argument from desire, right? We have these desires. Is it just a misguided yet ultimately good desire that, we've just warped, if you will, or bent, like Melissa said?
And I think, to give credit where credit is due, progressives, and forgive me for generalizing here, but I can't imagine that you could ever talk to even the most radical progressive and they would not say, hey, we can observe the world today, we can observe human society, and we know things are not the way they should be. I mean, Christians, that's central to our worldview as well, right? And so that's what your comments made me think of, Jeff, that yes, the world is not the way it should be. And so what are we all seeking? What's our universal human longing? It is for lack of a better word here, salvation. So how is it that progressives are pursuing salvation? And it's essentially a secular works-based salvation. And I guess the best way to define what they would think of salvation in terms of would be the utopianism. This idea that if we are good enough by progressive standards, and we work hard enough by progressive standards to demolish all oppression, then we can eventually achieve the salvation of what's the term they use? A society of equity, right? Not equality, but the much more radical idea of equity of outcome for all. And then that's the ultimate salvation in the progressive playbook, right?
I had a class, I think it was just called secularism in grad school. And my professor flippantly said that Marxism is just Christianity in the kingdom of God without God. And I think at first I was like, wow, that's kind of an interesting idea. And I think she's right. I pursued that. And it does seem like they want almost the redemption of the world, not just the individual. I kind of think the redeemed individual, or what the enlightened individual, is the woke person, but it's more than that. It's the whole world has to change for the better.
And so I think this is where we can pinpoint a pivotal difference between Christianity and the secular progressive, because in the Christian worldview, we're dealing with this hopeless, well, without Christ, this hopelessly fallen human nature. And no matter what we do in our own strength, we cannot achieve that redemption. And so as far as the Christian worldview is concerned, we are wholly dependent upon the redemption achieved for us through Jesus Christ. And so we see that as the exclusive path for ultimate salvation of humanity, whereas the progressives are depending exclusively upon the might makes right principle that we talked about earlier, that on human power, we can move towards that utopian state. And so here's where we're at loggerheads, right? And it all ties back to what we believe about ultimate reality, human nature, where we are in the cosmic scheme of things.
Yes, I think it also brings us back to this concept of soft totalitarianism too, because previously, and not very long ago, we could discuss the differences together civilly, but something's happened. I'm a big fan of public discourse, civil, rational public discourse, but somehow that's broken down. And it does seem like within the last 5 years, it has happened. And I think it has to do with rejecting reason as the means for discussion. And so we are left with power. And the soft totalitarianism is that sort of use of power where we would otherwise have discussion.
Do I remember correctly? Does Dreher talk about parroting? The parrot is in the bird, parroting beliefs as opposed to actually having formed one's own beliefs? Or am I pulling from somewhere else?
I don't remember reading that, but it does fit.
It may be a discussion that we had over the holidays. My brother-in-law and his wife have 2 young children, and they have tried valiantly through all of this, as my mother-in-law says, COVIS. They have tried to stick with some kind of non-home based schooling, and part of that is it's inconvenient. Where we have come back home with our 2 smallest ones. They were in a hybrid situation, and part of the discussion was that education just isn't working. And so we had a long conversation about progressivism and the difference between trying to tell young children when they're in kindergarten, this is the truth, and then tell them again in 5th grade, oh, by the way, this is the truth. And then tell them again when they're in high school, oh, by the way, this is the truth. And I'm not talking about Christianity, I'm talking about academic ideas, as opposed to leading them through the thought process, what we would look at as grammar, logic, and rhetoric. And that, we instill the building blocks, and then we play with them enough to understand them, and then we can build something we can show someone else, and then we can have a conversation about that which we have built. Well, if we don't follow that path, and progressivism did away with that path, I think part of what has caused the United States to last so long is you've got people like my grandmother, who in the 1920s in rural Tennessee, progressivism hadn't hit yet, and she was still learning amo amasamat, amamus amatus amat. She was still learning Latin. She was still learning, these classical ideas in this classical way. And so you had this, and continue today to have this rift that has grown between those areas where progressivism in education took the deepest root, and where it has been longer to influence and establish. But if we don't get the core concepts in whatever the topic is, and learn those well enough to play with them and have these discussions and have these free-flowing discussions, where we risk being wrong, we risk being corrected, and see that as a good thing, then all that we can do is parrot the ideas that the authority has handed us. And in that, there is no conversation. There's just assent or dissent. There's just conflict. And so relationship breaks down. And then lacking relationship, there's really nothing to keep me from, one of my favorite lines is it the Avengers or what's the other one that has the little robot, not robot, but the it's got the tree, the Groot, and then it's got the little raccoon, and the raccoon at one point towards the end says, what if someone has something that I want, can I just take it from them? Like, no, that's wrong. But I want it more than they do. You don't understand. And so when there's not conversation, and I believe that the ability for conversation grows out of this path, this ancient path in the trivium, when that is lacking and honest dialogue cannot take place, there's no relationship. And without relationship, there's nothing that keeps me from walking across the street and knocking my neighbor in the head and taking what they have, because obviously I want it more than they do. And so with progressivism and education and human destiny, the way things restructure under a totalitarian rule, you have those who still have residual moral imperative not to go knock their neighbor in the head, and those who don't have that. And I think that's where some of this, when we see good people paralyzed, it's because the option seems to be violence as opposed to discourse. And Kelly, I don't know, how do we have a conversation with somebody who's not willing to have the conversation, and who just devolves to or regresses to, because of progressivism, regresses to force?
I don't know. And we used to have rule of law to back up, the breakdown of using reason. But I kind of feel like rule of law is no one's willing to hold anyone accountable anymore.
I mean, Dreher talks about, and it was in our last, I think it was chapter 2, how totalitarianism requires that it's a complete picture of reality, right? In order, it has to be all encompassing. And the minute it's not, then, then it's been exposed for what it is. So part of me, I think that might be the answer to Jeff's question is, and yours too, Kelly, like, if we have these tendencies, and if we are moving in this direction, then they have to get rid of discourse, because even to admit the possibility that there are alternative views, it needs to be shut down, because the one thing that any totalitarian system can't have is like the idea put in people's head, right, that we're not the definer of reality. It's like and I know Dreher mentions it. I don't remember if he's mentioned it yet, which chapter he mentions it in, but from Havel about the sign in the window, right? And that one grocer who won't put the sign in the window. And the minute that happens, you've shown that it's possible to kind of defy that official story. So they can't have that. That guy has to be killed because he's not, he's a problem now. He's shattering the myth. So I don't know, but maybe that's why we can't have discourse, because if we are trying to put this kind of totalitarian system, if there are elements that are trying to put this into place, I mean, they can't have discussion. It's not, it doesn't fit with their aims.
This is exactly where I have a little hope, because we are human beings, and I do think we have a nature, and that nature is we desire to know. And I don't think that can be squelched totally. And I do think we're rational, and we do have the capacity to look at alternatives. Even if we're fed one position only, our mind can explore. And so I don't think you can totally put that out. And so I have hope, because we are humans, and I do think we're made in the image of God, and we have certain capacities that you can't eradicate those.
It's a stubborn image. It's an image. Move on to chapter 4.
Yes, I think that would be good.
Or is there? Okay. I was going to say I don't know narrative and myth part of the discussion. We can really spend a lot of time in the second half of the book on that. So maybe that's okay to sideline that the social pressure that we're already feeling.
Okay, so chapter 4 is capitalism, woke, and watchful. And I'm hoping you guys can say more about this, because I felt like I said a lot about the religion part. And I don't know. I don't know what to think about this chapter. It's scary. Maybe we should summarize a little bit what this one's about. Do you want to try, Jack? Or you look like you were going to say something.
No, I mean, it's interesting because, I mean, he talks about a few elements, right, of our current capitalistic system. First of all, that there is this element of, let's say, ideological pressure that influences companies, it influences consumers, etc. Hence the woke part. And then there's the watchful part, which, so this is a scary, well, okay, it's all scary. This is a scary part for me. Because, man, like when you, and it kind of, I mean, I don't know, but I never, recently, I've just seen, like the Netflix documentary, what is it, The Social Dilemma, right? And, reading books like this, and seeing some of the governmental, concerns that have been expressed about big tech, everything they have. So I don't know. I guess the watchful part, I mean, it's scary in and of itself, but when you combine it with the ideological part of the first, of the, the beliefs driving corporations, I guess you can have one, you can have the other. When you put them together, though, I at least thought it was particularly terrifying.
I agree. And so part of the story is that during the Cold War era, the state, the almighty state, was the totalitarian system. And with the collapse of communism, we have like big government, which we don't like, but we also have big business, which conservatives were kind of okay with. And then there was this shift from big business being kind of the conservative side to it being a progressive activist, almost the arm of the progressive movement. And Dreher sees that as really a new thing and kind of, dangerous. So when big business moves leftward, and he says this happens in 2015, and he has this sort of summary about why that happened. And they have now corporate social responsibility, which goes with the wokeness crowd.
One of the questions that you had asked is, why is this combination of capitalism and wokeism important, and what are the implications? And my thought on that is that it's a measure of equity and enforcing equity with equality of outcome. It's an attempt to enforce equality of outcome. So you dig the best ditch you can do. There's, you can get to here, and if you perform the best, to keep the analogy, if you perform the best colonoscopy that you can, then you get this. You're at this same level of pay, and so there's an equality of outcome, and maybe it's stratified a little bit, but it's equal, and so there is no individual influence other than conforming to the system. And maybe that's a good thing, maybe that's a bad thing, but it's the other half of it, which is the centralizing of access to opportunity for equality, or the centralizing of access to the to borrow Marx's term, the means of production, or the means of exploitation of opportunity, and the legislating for or against somebody because of a and really so much of this is arbitrary, but some arbitrary definition of whether you are worthy to have access to opportunity. That to me is underlying this discussion. You have to centralize the authority to have access to opportunity in order to even approach the possibility of influencing inequality of outcome. And that just means centralization and pulling all the authority in, which obviously is not impossible, but is going to be very, very difficult in this country to do that for various mechanisms that were put in place at the beginning. One of the things that we see in this direction is an attempt to put classifications on, or at the beginning anyway, an attempt to stigmatize those who don't automatically agree with the woke view, and to put social pressure, which again is very regressive, to put social pressure that then is followed up by whether it's burning down the business or fining the business or whatever it is, because they won't conform to the new ideology. So that's a start, but the ultimate pathway is that the centralized authority must control access to any kind of opportunity, and that's where it becomes illegal to grow vegetables in your backyard. Which, by the way, is not a radical idea. That's a historical idea. You're growing something for your personal benefit on the public property. Well, you can't do that. So before someone says, "Oh, they're never going to outlaw growing vegetables in your own backyard," well, it's been done, so it can be done.
So I had this thought, given the previous chapter, can we say that somehow the corporations are becoming, I don't know, the gatekeepers of the religion, sort of? The gatekeepers to sort of cultural power in a way.
I think that's fair. And they also, I mean, at the end of the day, right, we're consumers and we like to be comfortable most of the time. And, we might not always have all the money and resources that we would like, I guess, to make ourselves perfectly comfortable. But to think that, anything could impede our access to purchasing something makes us really uncomfortable, right? It makes us, so I wonder if that, in that sense, then I suppose the corporations are a very good gatekeeper, because, it's going to be very hard for us to, like, in our current mindset, and I include myself in this greatly. I would be very disappointed if Amazon wouldn't deliver packages for free on my porch. I would be very disappointed, because I like having things shipped to me in a few days. So, yeah, I think that's a fair characterization that the corporations then, and economic activity in general, I guess, because we had brought in the conversation, right? I can't have the job I want because I don't hold the right beliefs. I can't work for that company. This kind of gets back into Dreher's Benedict option a little bit, that, Christians might have to prepare to not work in certain professions, if the bar requires you to affirm certain things before you can practice, or the medical boards, or whatever. So but for the context of this conversation, yeah, I certainly think, economic activity and corporations, businesses in general are, yeah, it's fair to call them a gatekeeper.
Does this take us into the social credit conversation now in China as the example of that?
I think so. On 85, Dreher is writing about China's emerging AI-powered techno-totalitarian state. And he quotes a guy named John Lanchester. I don't know who that is, but the aim is to form a new kind of human being, one who has fully internalized the demands of the state and the completeness of its survival and control. And my big question, just from a utilitarian point of view, is how is somebody who has fully internalized the demands of the state and the completeness of its surveillance and control, how does that person then benefit the collective other than being someone who has fully internalized the demands of the state and the completeness of its surveillance and control? It seems to completely strip away the individualism, which is a core pillar in postmodernism and in progressivism. At least I think it is. So I just wonder how somebody who actually becomes that person, who is given over completely to the demands of the state, how do they then contribute positively to their neighbor?
I wonder if it isn't a positive contribution, but it's a passive, they're not in the way, so that those in power can accomplish big things. They just become a passive observer, living in their comfort zone.
I guess, and this kind of brings us back to the beginning of our conversation a little bit, but yeah, like you said, Kelly, there'd be no resistance, right? And if, this new kind of human being in the quote that you read, Jeff, so if I know exactly what the state needs from me, and I'm okay with that, and that implies I fully trust that what the state needs is good, right? I don't resist it, so I'm assuming, all right, the state has, let's say, my best interest at heart, or society's best interest at heart. This brings us back to that idea of a religion again, because, here you have, as Christians, we have an all-knowing, all-good God. In this, you have an all-knowing, all-good state who will take care of you. It knows your needs better than you do. It knows yourself. And so, like we as Christians say, it's really comforting, right? That God knows what I need and what I want. And, it's nice to have a God who cares about me. Maybe that's the other side of this. The alternative is, man, it's really nice to have a state that knows about me and cares about me. So why would I resist? Maybe if you buy into that full swing, why would I resist?
So it kind of goes back to that comfortable life, or maybe the state gives the individual the opportunity to express their nature or make themselves. They don't express their nature, but they make themselves. Remember the liquid modernity portion? You can be whatever you feel like being, as long as you work within the confines of these categories that have been created, like group identity.
So, you can work within these confines, which have been carefully outlined by those in power to remain in power, right? So this, they would never have you grab an identity as a revolutionary who's going to overthrow the system, right? They would, which is ironic given, Marxist history, right? History is built on conflict. So it's kind of interesting, like the end game. Well, that's a whole other question, so I won't go there right now. But it is interesting, like you're right, that if you fit in these prescribed roles, then perhaps, if you fit in these prescribed roles, of course they're okay because they're not going to rise up. Like you can be the good teacher who teaches our curriculum and does it really well. But look at you, you're such a good teacher because you're helping future generations. You're saving the world for eternity.
That's so suppressive.
I had the thought that it's so boring.
Yeah.
There's nothing exciting about this view to me. Maybe if I was young and I, could be a social justice warrior, maybe, but it's not enough. It's not, it promises meaning and it doesn't deliver.
So why that term? Where does this phrase even come from, of social justice warrior? That is so idealistic. It is just dripping with, man, I'm 17 and that's what I want to be. Why not give it a different definition? Why not call it something else? That is such a crafty term. Why not force your neighbor to do it the way that you've accepted as right? There's got to be dominate the opposition. There's got to be.
Jeff, I don't know. I kind of feel like we might be in the same generation, but we were raging against the machine, weren't we? It's kind of the same thing, only
No. That was okay. That was okay. This is.
I think those are the people who are leading the social justice movement now.
Yeah.
Those people who listen to that are now professors.
Mm-hmm.
Like I said, a lot of it's a marketing thing, right? It sounds good. Like you said, it's dripping with all that. And that term justice right in the middle, that's huge. And it's actually something I kind of thought about in I forget what word it was in context with. But, it's a Christian word. Justice is a very biblical word. And, there is a longing for justice. And again, that's some common ground, right? We want justice as Christians, but you slip in a different definition to a biblically illiterate culture who has no idea. And so you're to church and your pastor says, he's preaching a sermon about justice. And in your mind, you're thinking, if, you're putting this new definition onto the words that you're now hearing. And oh well, I don't. It kind of undermines the traditional definition, puts in a new definition, but still has the positive connotations of the old definition, right? Because I mean, who's going to fight against justice? You know, I'm not going to go out there and say I hate justice, because I don't hate justice, but we have to define that term. But that comes back way to the beginning of the conversation, right? Where if there's no reason, no common ground, good luck sharing a definition.
That's true, Zach. And I also think justice is part of a worldview, and how you define justice depends on all those other pieces that we were talking about as a religion. So it's, I think Marxism has co-opted a lot of Christian terms or ideas and changed them according to the assumptions, particularly materialist assumptions.
Melissa, I don't know why, but I think you probably have a good insight into what I'm about to ask. Kind of getting inside the mind of the person who has accepted social justice warrior, how would they define those who don't get it? Like if they were to label those who don't get it, how would they define them? And then what assumptions are they making about those who don't pick up a sign and join them down at the state capitol to do whatever it is they do down there? And what I'm seeking is, some slippery as it may be, some notion of who we're dealing with or what assumptions they're making, so that we can better approach them in attempts for conversation, as opposed to just throwing them out. Because I'll say this emerging generation has so much that is just beautiful in their idealism and in their willingness to fight for ideas. I think the education system has failed them in what they will be able ultimately to do with their passion and their energy. But I really admire the passion and the energy and the desire that they have. So what are some core assumptions from a religious point of view that somebody who accepts the moniker social justice warrior would have? And then how do we approach them? And I think Dreher definitely talks about this in the second half of the book, but if you could help me out with understanding from a religious point of view, what is this person going to insist on? What are they going to rail against?
I'm at a loss. I really don't know how to go about answering that. The place my mind keeps going back to, because I'm imagining myself in this dialogue with this radical social justice warrior, and I'm a question asker. And so faced with countering their ideology in conversation, the first thing I would ask them is, what do you mean by justice? And we've already talked about that here, this sneaky slipping in of a different definition to the word justice. But then I would try to walk them backwards from how they're defining justice, because they're going to say something along the lines of fairness, and they're going to root that in this idea of human equality. And so that's kind of where I feel like we as Christians have this edge, because at that point we can say, well, what do you mean by human equality? And where are you getting it? Like, how are you grounding this idea that all human beings are equal and are deserving of your definition of justice? Like, show me where that's coming from. Show me a standard for human equality, and let's start from there. Now, from a Christian perspective, I can tell you that we can ground that in the very nature God has given us by creating us in his image. But where are you getting it? And I heard this great lecture by philosopher J.P. Moreland years and years ago. And he said, if you cannot ground this idea of human equality and thereby justice in the idea of humans being made in the image of God, then you might as well just ground it in something like the size of your belly button, right? So then where does that get you? Because belly buttons come in all different shapes and sizes. And some people, because of surgical procedures, no longer even have a belly button. And so that was just his comical way of pointing out the fact that any other place besides being made in God's image that you try to ground this idea of human equality, you're going to ultimately fail. Because there is nothing about humanity that is the same for every single person, past, present, and future. And so I think this is a really excellent inroad for these kinds of conversations for Christians, an inroad for Christians, where I think we can make progress, even in this era where it seems like reason has fallen by the wayside and truth is a slippery concept. I think that this is where we have to go, and this is where we can open eyes about the fundamental and fatal problem with the progressive ideology. And Jeff, I'm sorry if that has nothing to do with what you were asking. It's just where my mind was going as I was listening to your comments.
No, I think that's helpful. And again, I'm really, part of me really wants to just, like I joked earlier, what we did as youth, that was fine. That was what we were supposed to do. But this is going on now is nefarious in some kind of way. And it does feel like there is some sinister element to it. But at the same time, I think it was Jesus's intent to be martyred when he started calling people vipers. That's just not helpful language for a discourse. It'll certainly draw people to action, but it's not helpful for trying to work with somebody in the here and now moment. I'm not called to be Jesus in that sense. I don't think. I think he did that and did it very well, and I'm called to do something else in speaking with and seeking to defend what it is I believe without causing somebody without provoking somebody to some violent reaction. So yeah, just questioning and being curious, then being honestly curious of how is that unfair, or how is what you're proposing justice. That makes a lot of sense. And that's the way I think even addressing people when you're in religious conversations, having to deal with traditional religions, it makes sense to be curious and not to be threatened by what the answer is going to be, because we stand in our faith and we stand in grace, but to be open and to be willing to entertain the fact that while I may be on the path of righteousness, that doesn't necessarily make me absolutely righteous and unable to grow and learn. That there are still things that I can learn from those who hold diverging views, or those who I think might hold diverging views. But that's something else entirely. So I'm still troubled by how somebody who is completely sold over to the demands of the state benefits the collective, other than not being an impurity that has to be driven out.
Maybe this is one of those pieces that doesn't hold up under scrutiny. I mean, I think we have to say there does seem to be some internal contradictions. Maybe this is one of them.
I'm satisfied with that. with that answer.
Before we go too far away from where Melissa was talking about having these conversations, I do think it's important to recognize that a lot of people have bought into a system without. I highly doubt if you survey, if you survey, people who are protesting here and there, and shamefully we can say it about conservatives and about Christians as well, but it's not like we've had a resurgence of the reading of Karl Marx, and everyone all of a sudden has read everything by Marx and they know everything about Marxism. And a lot of times it's, oh, socialism sounds really good because it will pay my college debt. And, my family has struggled with economic hardships. So it sounds like the alternative, right? So I do think there is, I think this approach of asking questions would be really helpful in that context, because a lot of times it's, you see this again on those like campus reform videos, where they propose like two tax systems, right? And say, oh, well, this is Bernie Sanders' tax system. And they tell all these young people, and it turns out it was like Donald Trump or George W. Bush or someone. It's they don't really know what they're promoting all the time. They just know they don't like the status quo. Kind of that Rage Against the Machine, I suppose, from a generation prior to mine, but we won't go there. I think that I think that may just be part of it. It's that dissatisfaction with the way things are now. So asking questions might help at least unpack. Okay, well, I know I need an answer, and maybe this answer that I've, that's popular and sounds good on the surface. Maybe it's not the best. So at the very least, asking questions might spur that person to ask more questions, and continue down that path. So that's certainly a positive outcome, and it's a really great way, I think, Melissa, to engage with these kinds of conversations.
Zach, what you just said is giving me a little more hope, I think, because I think what happened, and maybe happens often, is that people absorb a belief. Like young people were raised in the church, they pick up on its culture without particularly understanding it or being committed to it. And then it kind of, because they didn't answer questions or they didn't commit to it personally, they walk away. I'm wondering if that could happen with young people in social justice too. It didn't, because there are these internal contradictions, it didn't answer their questions. It didn't give them the meaning they were looking for. And so they become willing to question it when that occurs. So there's a kind of Christian fideism, blind belief. There may be a progressive fideism too, and that may become a source of discontent later, and they are willing to engage in discussion or pursue the kinds of questions you are both bringing up right now. I think the question we're avoiding, though, is the technology and the surveillance and the China issue. It has become more real for me lately with the discussions about COVID-19 and the vaccines and, oh, I'm not supposed to say these things, but tracking and the use of technology for those kinds of things. When I first read this book, I kind of thought, no, this will never happen. But now I'm starting to consider it as a reality.
Yeah, I was just reading several articles last week as I was doing research on this idea of vaccination passports. And I will tell you, I almost couldn't believe what I was reading, because it was, these articles were just laying it out. Look, you better plan on being vaccinated, because otherwise these are the way these are all the ways in which your life will be restricted in a year very soon to come. And now in the long term, these are the ways your life is going to be restricted. And so in a way, it's analogous to the social credit system in China. If you do not do this thing, then your life, your freedoms are going to be restricted in these other ways. And so the one most soon to be implemented, according to these 3 different articles I read, was that if you do not submit to the vaccine, you will no longer be able to travel by airplane internationally. And that will quickly turn into being able to travel by air at all, so even domestically, without a vaccine passport. It reminded me so much of Dreher's discussion on the Chinese social credit system. So we're talking about doing something to your physical body in order to be able to live a normal life, as we would define living normal life right now.
Well, the extension of that, with the disruption that will come for those who do not submit, is, I mean, just imagine a map, and here's the home of somebody who does not submit. And because we know where everybody is at and who everybody is and who has and has not, of course, unless you're talking about an election, anyway, with there's a little circle around this house that is a red circle because this person has not been vaccinated. And so whether or not anybody else in that family has or not, this house is now it's an unvaccinated location. It's a dangerous location. And so when family comes from out of town and their little green dots are coming over and traveling in on the map, and then they go inside the house of the red circle person, well, when they come out, they're now red and green. They've been tainted because you would not submit, which, again, this regressive idea of social pressure. Imagine church and trying to get back to, or the Lions Club or whatever it is, trying to get back to some kind of in-person meeting, and you've got somebody who's coming out of a red zone into this green zone, and now this green zone is no longer green because the person wasn't vaccinated, and the intense pressure to conform or be cut off that is there. And we've been primed over the last generation, especially, while promoting the idea of my individual worth, we aren't really promoting the value of the individual. And so the ability to be cut off and be okay with that is greatly diminished from what it was 40, 50, 60 years ago. And so this intense nonviolent pressure, and then what do you do with those who just absolutely will not submit? Is that red circle around the house, is that a target, as opposed to some way to track those with contact tracing? So, and the technology is there to do pretty much anything that we can imagine. So that becomes a whole nother, Zach, like you were saying, it's kind of scary what is and what is ready to be in this conversation about the kind of control the state can exert through tracing. I think probably another, in addition to Covis and Frood, we could probably add Schnurden to the list of words that can't be used on YouTube anymore. But he absolutely spoke to the fact that there is this apparatus that is capable of analyzing every single word, every single conversation, and tying it all together and saying whether or not somebody conforms to the ideological set of beliefs that are going to be tolerated. So yeah, that does get scary, and that takes us straight into the China question with the AI and what they have in place. Zach, you had something about the Chinese style hard totalitarianism. Do you want to go ahead and get into that?
Sure. Yeah, I'll throw that question out there. So, although I noticed that my page numbers don't match up to y'all's, it's on 89 in my version. I'm reading from an electronic version, so I'm sorry if it's a little bit off. But Dreher writes, if Democratic majorities come to believe that transferring social control, and in context here, he's talking about technology and data, to governmental and public institutional elites is necessary to guarantee virtue and safety, then it, meaning Chinese-style hard totalitarianism, will happen. And so I guess the question that this brought up for me is it ever possible to guarantee the safety and security, virtue that the government, private institutions that they promise they'll deliver, right? So if you give us this, data, this insight into your life, can they actually deliver on that promise? I think Dreher would say certainly not, but I'm curious what we think.
I am wondering, when did safety become like the highest value in society? And why should the government? I mean, I want safety from like maybe criminals, foreign invaders. I think the government has a job in protecting me from those things, but does the government or institutions have the job of protecting me totally? I mean, from viruses?
Well, what kind of lab environment would there need to be around every single person in order for that to be a guarantee that could be kept? I think it assumes a level of omniscience that's beyond any combination of humans to approach.
You see, and that was kind of where my question, I think, was coming from, right? Because again, we've been talking about government, business, institution, whatever, as a replacement for God, right? Most of our conversation today has been, we're trying to find this human progressivist way to replace God. And here, I mean, I think you're right. I think we would need that level of omniscience that I don't know that anyone, is capable of providing. And, when I was just thinking while we were talking, there's that Ben Franklin quote, right? Those who give up liberty, want to purchase safety, neither deserve liberty nor safety. That's a paraphrase. I know it's rough, but and so coming back to your point, Kelly, since when was safety our highest value? I mean, certainly after Ben Franklin. So that transition is relatively recent in the scale of like human history. I mean, I don't have a better, firmer point for you, but it's relatively recent in the grand scheme of like the discussion of ideas.
Yeah, like maybe the millennial generation where they wore helmets on their bikes. Just kidding.
Well, I mean, if you think about it, at the root of this ideology, and we just briefly touched on this at the beginning of the conversation, is materialism. And if materialism, if that's true, that's a true picture of the world, then this physical life is all we have. And I'm speaking individually. We have this one material life, and that is all. There's nothing that comes after. And so the concept of safety flies way up the charts in terms of importance, because we need safety to be able to live as long as possible and to maximize the life that we do have, since there is no hope for anything after. Right. So it's all about living long and fighting hard to leave a legacy that will help those who come after us to live as long as possible and wield as much power as possible to make as much change as possible. And so this pandemic has sort of struck at the most opportune time for the progressive cause, because now it's this whole idea of having something that threatens physical well-being, that threatens safety, and that can be wielded as a weapon, right? To get people to fall in line and do what the social and political elites say we should be doing, right?
Yeah, I think that's really insightful, Melissa. This fear comes in like, this is my only life, and I could lose it quickly to some small virus. And again, I have to say that this view is, my friend said, soulless. It's soulless. It has no life to it. This is boring. If I have to like worry about my safety all the time, what am I living for? What are the obstacles I have to overcome? A virus?
And this gets back to when you look at the history of ideas and those most ancient of ideas, and you trace out now, as we've defined progressivism, I think we're agreeing with Dreher that it is religious, or it is religion, a type of a new religion. That all religious ideas start with either the maximization of or the transcendence of materialism, except for God, who declares himself in the very opening breath of his revelation as pre-existent, as pre-material. And so that really does become the choice of, do we want to live assuming that everything is material and this is the one shot, and in other words, I want it more than you do, and so I'm going to come knock you in the head and take it because I want it more. And, obviously I can do that, and so that makes it right that I can do it, makes it right that I do it, whether you're talking about the guy across the street or you're talking about the guy at 1600. And so that's the material, that's the maximal material position. Or that we have this evidence that is so ancient that it predates, it is a preemptive strike against all of these other systems that claims pre-material existence, which is obviously, for all of the ideas that humans have come up with, is obviously outside our scope to creatively come up with on our own. We have to have somebody bring that into our grammar for us to be able to discuss it. And so sans that information, all that humans can come up with is material, because based in material existence, material outcomes or material pursuits, or to somehow transcend the material. And so I think there's a powerful apologetic in the fact that God declares himself, and you have to grapple with this. God declaring himself as pre-existent before human systems have come into play, or before the record of human systems have come into play. And all that humans have been able to do is create material systems. That you've got to grapple with that. And I think when somebody honestly deals with that question of how on earth does this archaic, irrelevant document in its opening sentence and in its closing paragraph speak to an eternal, non-material existence, when we don't have any basis in our existence to come up with that idea, how does that happen? And that becomes the struggle, that becomes the choice. And what information are you going to allow people to have access to so they can come up with their own ideas? And what are you going to limit them from so that they don't ask these pesky questions about God?
I think this might be a natural place to pause, because the second half of the book does address the role of religion and some of these other ideas that you're bringing up, Jeff. I'm wondering if anyone wants to make any concluding comments on these two chapters that we went over. So we talked about progressivism as a religion. I hear us kind of agreeing that it is an alternative religion, and maybe it's a rival to Christianity, or it sees Christianity as it has to displace Christianity, at least in the West. And then we talked about capitalism, woke, and watchful, and the joining of these corporations with this progressive religion now to kind of enforce it through social pressure and technology. Anybody want to add anything?
Well, and one thing we did not touch on, and forgive me, I don't remember if this is a point that Dreher emphasizes in the book. I need to go back and reread. But one thing that I think about an awful lot is how not only in terms of corporate wokeness, but also the arts, how much we're seeing wokeness promulgated in the arts, particularly at the cinematic arts, so television, film, and how we're seeing very quickly seeing the media, the entertainment media, succumb to it, and it's like all of a sudden TV and film plot lines everywhere are promoting the woke narrative. I mean, just left and right. And I could give some really interesting examples if we had more time to develop that. But I definitely think that's probably an even more persuasive way in human culture to make ideological headway than even the corporate pathways.
I think you're right. And I also think those things were going to come up in the second half of the book too. So let's hold on to that. The role of the arts, the role of the academy, the role of business. It's like the institutions. It is being displacing previous values in the institutions. So yeah. Good. Well, thank you, friends, for this conversation again. I look forward to our next installment.